Well, let me also thank you all for joining us today and welcome you at our, as Dagmar said, second lunch talk session. And particularly, I would like to warmly welcome Professor Dr. Margaret Schotte from York University, Toronto, Canada, who is our speaker today and who had to get up a bit early today to give this talk. Thank you for that. And as Dagmar already mentioned, we have been trying to meet with Margaret for ages, first at a conference, then at a workshop, then at TNA, but well, as you all know, 2020 had other plans. So we were really happy that we were able to win you as a speaker for this lunch talk series, Margaret, and it's now my pleasure to introduce you at least with 5 sentences. So Margaret E. Schotte is an associate professor at York University. She studies early modern history of science, specializing in book history, history of technology, and the cultural and social history of Europe from 1500 to 1800. Margaret Schotte graduated with a degree in history and literature from Harvard University. She began her study of early print culture through a hands-on apprenticeship at a rare bookshop in New York City, which is fantastic. Margaret completed her doctorate at Princeton University, her dissertation, a calculated course creating transoceanic navigators 1580 to 1800, received the Frank Bröse Prize for outstanding doctoral thesis in maritime history in 2016. Today, she will tell us more about her recent and already very reputable publication, her wonderful book, Sailing Schools, which is a page turner. And since Christmas is around the corner, well, the book is a winner of the 2020 Leo Gershoy Award of the American Historical Association and the John Lyman Award of the North American Society for Oceanic History. Her paper today is called Navigation Lessons from the Prize Papers. So Margaret, now the stage is yours.
All right. Give me 1 minute to try and share the right part of my presentation. Here we go. Okay. So, good?
Yes.
All right. So, zuerst möchte ich Lukas und Dagmar für die nette Einladung herzlich bedanken. Es ist ganz schön, euch endlich mal zu treffen und ein bisschen über dieses hervorragendes Projekt zu reden. Obwohl wir leider kein Weihnachtskuchen zusammen essen können, freue ich mich sehr auf unser Gespräch heute. Weil es ziemlich viele Jahre ist, seit ich Deutsch geübt habe, gehe ich jetzt weiter auf Englisch. Können Ihnen alle mein PowerPoint sehen? Okay, gut. So, I do not have to tell anyone in this group about the documentary riches of the prize papers at the UK National Archives. We know they contain a wealth of information about trade and commerce and insights into international and personal relationships between people on ships and ashore. But how much technical information is there about how mariners on these vessels did their jobs? Well, it is there, but it is not perhaps obvious on first glance. As Lucas mentioned, last year, I published a book about how sailors learned to navigate. This grew out of my curiosity about, of all things, neglected math textbooks. Those had piqued my interest when I was working for a rare book dealer, an antiquariat in New York. And it turns out there are a lot of textbooks published by small independent teachers all across Europe, but not all that much modern interest in reading them. I decided to pursue a PhD in the history of science, and then my dissertation developed when I realized I could link my love of the sea with those unloved textbooks. So I set out to see how many working sailors actually read them. This ultimately led me to the National Archives for the first time in 2009. Someone, I believe a Dutch historian involved with the Sailing Letters project, which is kind of a precursor to the prize papers, had told me that there were lots of fascinating but uncatalogued documents that might be relevant to my project. Take a look at HCA 30 and HCA 32. Okay, but how do you find relevant material among the thousands of documents, especially when I could only make very brief research trips to London? And how to tackle this a decade ago before the documents were systematically cataloged, let alone digitized. So today, let me offer 3 examples of how I've had luck finding treasures in the prize papers. First, creative search terms. Second, distinctive formats. And third, expanding the search beyond the prize papers. As colossal as those are, it's helpful to look elsewhere. When I first went to the archives, I wasn't exactly sure what I would find or what questions I'd be able to answer. I just knew I wanted to pull up any evidence of sailors learning navigation or math or maybe other types of training. And this required me to cast a really wide net for search terms to just try and catch as many potentially relevant documents as possible. So as I mentioned, I began my PhD after working for half a dozen years as a rare book dealer. And that experience led me to take a material book history approach to a lot of my work. Whoops. So this means that I actually decided to see what would happen if I looked for bound books in the masses of archival documents. Among the letters and sort of miscellaneous papers, what happens if you try and find print? Of course, how do you search for printed material in the National Archives catalog? It was a little tricky. So certain terms, I thought, well, what if I look for bound in? Well, that's a bookseller's term, but it turned out not to be useful in the prize papers catalog because the records might say a ship was bound from Hamburg to Bordeaux or bound from Amsterdam to Rouen. So that was not unhelpful. I tried leather. It more often came up as one of the items among the cargo, and the same with calf. You'd either find calf skins or, kind of amusingly, I think you'd find a lot of ships called the Golden Calf. So again, not going to help me find interesting material. I did strike gold when I searched the word parchment. Parchment or vellum, of course, is a very sturdy material, and it's particularly valuable at sea because it is waterproof. So when I searched for parchment, I found a number of really neat almanacs, leather-bound wallets like this one here. You can see another one, and I particularly love this. You can see, it's quite low quality vellum. You can see it's not very clean, and you could still see the pores from the animal skin. In addition to, interesting sort of personal account records and jottings that are in these little small pocket books, there's actually a pocket underneath the flap over on the right. It's just barely visible in this previous image here, this little slit. And in that pocket, I found a secret. So I'm dying to hear how you guys are going to be digitizing these. There's something just so exciting about opening a pocket at the edge of this binding and finding these little scraps of paper. And I was sure I must be the first person to find these little slips. And I was so curious to see what they contained. Well, it turns out they're just sales receipts. They talk about how much people paid for anchorage or whether they bought barrels of wine. I was a little disappointed, but at the same time, maybe in another binding there will be other secrets. So that was kind of a neat moment in the archives. My search for vellum bindings turned up a number of published books, which again was exciting from a book historian's point of view. This was a volume of tables from around 1850. And this is the type of thing that every navigator would have on board. You absolutely, especially the Dutch, would refer to these for all of their daily calculations. And this volume is also a great example when we look at the binding. Not only is it sort of slapped together into a waterproof, inexpensive vellum binding, but when you look at the back of the book, which is the right-hand picture, you can see that it was actually upcycled from a nautical chart. If you look at those diagonal lines there, it's a hint that those are, a previously used chart recycled into a binding. Now, here is another type of item bound in parchment, which came up in my search. And this has actually become one of my most valuable primary sources. This is called a schaatkamer, or a treasure chest, a manuscript workbook written by a practicing mariner. So this is one example from probably the favorite ship of Lucas here, the Concordia. And it was made by Anders Wijkman, who I believe is Swedish, and he produced this in the year 1709. He signs it in a couple of places. So these Schaatkamer manuscripts typically are copies of textbooks that were published. And here you can see on the left this distinctive hand. I think Wijkman was not the best artist, but anyways, he's copying an image from a printed textbook. And it's a rule of thumb, which would help navigators determine the time of high tide, which is really important. And so my hypothesis is that Wijkman did a class in Amsterdam or another Dutch city, perhaps during a winter when he was not sailing. And then he carried this book on board with him. So he produced it in 1709, and we know from the prize papers that it was seized by the British in 1758. The trick is we don't actually know what happened between those dates. Here's just another image. Wijkman may possibly have passed his book along to another mariner. Another option is that he could have abandoned it in the bottom of a ship's chest sometime shortly after making it. And then when the Concordia was seized as a prize during the 7 Years' War, 40 years later, it got included among the papers. I like to think that really Wijkman brought it on board because it was one of his most valuable navigational tools, although we will never know. So if Wijkman's hefty volume was toned, you can see some of the ink is bleeding through the pages, and it's a little worn at the edges, but it's actually in remarkably decent shape. If we switch to a different collection of documents from a French vessel, also seized during the early months of the 7 Years' War, we see quite a different story. In the boxes associated with the ship whose story I'm writing up now, which is the French East Indiaman, the Prince de Conti, most of the papers look like this. Nibbled at the edges, possibly by mice or maybe just water damage. I told you I was looking for math. I love math. However, this math, page after page of it, is hard to decipher, hard to make head or tail of. I frantically shot photos of as many pages as I could, but really at that point wasn't sure what to make of this mass of material. I realize now it's actually a wonderful example of mariners practicing their mathematics on board ship. I'm still a ways away from deciphering all of these torn and smudged equations. I have a clue, and I will tell you that in a moment. But before I move to that example, let me draw your attention to a different type of paper from the same boxes. Among the Prince de Conti documents, I found a surprising group of papers. There are 16 of these little slips. They turn out to be daily observations signed by the main navigators aboard the Prince, Vincent Avril and Florentin Maurice, who were the first and second pilots. And it's interesting, both of these men had at least a decade or more of experience at sea. And yet, for more than 2 weeks in March and April of 1756, these two senior navigators made standard daily observations. But instead of simply recording them in their regulation logbooks, they noted them carefully they noted these observations carefully on these slips and turned them in. They dutifully signed each one of them, your very humble servant, and submitted them to a monsieur. So this raises interesting questions about their practice. Who was supervising their observations? I suspect it was the lieutenant on board, François-Marie Chotard, rather than the captain, who was Christophe d'Argy de la Châtre. It doesn't seem particularly mathematical from the record. However, I think maybe Chotard was almost running a shipboard school, even for these fairly senior navigators. So there's lots to study here. I have done a very preliminary track of those different observations, plotting the different routes using their slightly different numbers. So Maurice you can see in red and Avril in blue. And it's interesting, this map just shows the trouble of modern scholars using older data. I think that these figures here, which I've numbered 3, 4, 5, and 6, is actually when they were in the harbor of La Coruña, but they were using slightly different latitude and longitude figures than the modern maps. So it's not that they were bopping around out here off the coast. I think they were actually, again, we'll see, I'm not sure. I think that really the coordinates for the harbor were just different from those used by modern Google Maps. So we can learn several other things from this type of record. One is that instead of everyone on board a ship making one observation and sort of having a unified number in their logbooks, everyone is doing their own work. Maybe less reputable navigators might have copied someone else's numbers, but here each man is carrying out his own computations independently. And the discrepancies between two men taking the same observation at the same time every noon in this April, we actually see how difficult these estimates were, not only for longitude, which is famously tricky, but latitude as well. So there's an individual skill that persists within the science of navigation. You may wonder, how typical is this work and these types of papers? It turns out to be common, not only in the French maritime world, but internationally. In my book, I demonstrate that at least some of the nuts and bolts of a navigator's education were uniform across borders, regardless of language or teaching style, but they really were working on the same model. What I found particularly wonderful is that here is actually a Dutch example, again from the Concordia, recorded in virtually the same way as Maurice and Avril had done. So if anyone in trawling through these fonds comes across another of these small slips documenting daily observations, I would greatly appreciate hearing from you. Now, to return to the smudged and nibbled math homework that was so prevalent elsewhere on the Prince de Conti. In the spring of 2014, immediately after I completed my dissertation, I got to go on a lightning trip back to the UK for a conference at the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. I had a few hours to spend at the Caird Library, and so once again, I tried my very broad keyword search strategy. Because I was in a maritime archive, I thought I would look for my other main topic, which is mathematics. And so I found a whole new trove of material. And it was that material at the Caird that shed light on some of my outstanding puzzles from the prize papers. Let me just briefly introduce you to one of my favorite characters, who is Captain Edward Riou. He's a young officer in the Royal Navy. And he decided, or maybe his heirs did, to leave all of his material to the National Maritime Museum. He was a fellow of the Royal Society who was killed in 1801 while in a battle with Admiral Nelson. The archives seem to have every document pertaining to his life, from the letters that he wrote to his parents as a kid, to his student math textbooks. He was a very meticulous artist, and here we see some of his geometry. Nothing really like the water-stained detritus from Kew. Here's a particularly lovely perspectival drawing that he was working on. Riou had a rather disjointed career. He sailed with Captain Cook on his third voyage. It was posted to Newfoundland, and then he took a commission to ferry British convicts to Australia. And on that voyage, on the HMS Guardian in 1789, he struck an iceberg. And so if you'd like to read more, I can give you a discount code for my book. That's in chapter 5. It was kind of a remarkable story. Over the course of 9 weeks, he valiantly navigated the Guardian back to the Cape of Good Hope. And of course, in his meticulous fashion, he kept a perfect logbook. And even better for me, he kept his rough work. Here is a notebook of his miscellaneous computations. This one is not from the Guardian, but from earlier, 1782 to 87, or actually perhaps even earlier than that. And here Here, again, one of these little daily books, he labels it for us, his day's work aboard the Salisbury en route to Newfoundland, 1786. So this is my lightning moment. When I saw Rieu's day's work and the columns of numbers and the scratches and, you know, the kind of rough jottings, all of the extraneous papers from the Prince de Conti made sense. I realized these old rough papers that were just kind of gathered up along when the British seized all of the documents could very well be just those same days' work. I need to wait until COVID-19 is more under control to thoroughly test my theory. But at the moment, I'm willing to bet that many of those pages, salt-stained and torn at the edges, are in fact daily computations made by the navigators. So in addition to capturing evidence of shipboard training, we actually have a new window into shipboard practice. It's not just that the men were learning the formula in their manuscript workbooks, but here on these scraps preserved in the prize papers, we can see them applying their math. To wrap up, I can't really call these conclusions in such a brief talk, but really more takeaways. I hope they're just places for us to begin our conversation, and I really do hope we'll continue beyond this brief hour. So how have the prize papers helped me, and what can we learn as we go back to them over and over? First, really just even in preparing for today, it's fantastic to see the new catalog details. This project is going to expand the National Archives catalog records in invaluable ways. I'm astounded now when you go and look for parchment or vellum or leather, the number of records that have been usefully expanded is wonderful. So thank you for that. No longer will parchment be the only clue of printed material inside these boxes. The other thing, these documents provide evidence of what people valued. And here, I mean, not just the trade goods or even the letters home to their loved ones, but we can get a sense of objects that were important on board ship. The volume that Weichmann took with him, which seems to have remained on board for decades. It's simply wonderful to know which published books, like the tables by Vogt, were actually taken to sea. So this is really helping to fill in our picture of how print culture spanned the globe. And finally, it shows how people made use of their professional tools. Every page of crabbed, stained math is evidence of increasing numeracy rates. Every page of doodles is evidence of personalities, and we'll see these are universal and recognizable no matter which country they're from or which century. So from historians of science, of the book, of education and beyond, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for this fascinating talk and also for greeting us in German first. It was incredible. Perfect. Thank you. Yes, I really enjoyed your talk, and I just want to pick out one thing and then open the floor for discussion. I think it is fascinating and very important to approach the collection through a material kind of perspective. I thought this was really interesting. Lucas is the right person to ask the sort of better question, but to pay attention to the materiality and the meaning of materiality in relation to what you might find in terms of text and information. And you also asked how we, when we digitize, will preserve this, and we actually developed a particular way of allowing researchers who use the portal, the data portal, to be able to trace how individual documents were linked to each other, either being hidden, like you mentioned, in a little pocket in a notebook, or folded within each other. So researchers will be able to find this. We will keep this connection, and together with TNA, we have developed a method to make this searchable later on. So your paper today proved us right to pay attention to the materiality. So thank you for that. But it's not for me to ask I could ask the first question, but let me see. I would like to open the floor first.